This panel will try to answer on question of how to approach to just transition, or maybe even how to connect all of our fragments regarding our main title of this year Academy. I will be your chair from now. My name is Dražen Šimleša, and this year I'm in Program Council, and for many years collaborating with IPE and sitting in Academic Council. So, people right on time. Remember when we yesterday talked about that instead of 10 minutes as first night we will be in 7 minutes, but you know this story when you really know what you want to say, that you can say it in 1 minute. So it is a surprise for you. We are playing this game tonight. I'm joking, but let's start to not lose any more time from this panel. Jagoda, you are a long-term activist in mostly environmental sector. But today, as a director of Friends of the Earth Europe, maybe you are a good person to start as someone from one really visible and not so often connected with other fragments in history from environmental sector, about some new campaigns regarding just transition, how you in Friends of the Earth trying to overcome this issue of unconnected fragments.
Thank you, Dražen. Now I feel like on contest for Miss Universe or Miss World, when you have 30 seconds to answer how to solve a crisis in Middle East. I just joke, which I spent first half of my minute, and obviously didn't make you laugh. So, thanks. Well, starting with fragments, I mean, Friends of Europe is part of international network which has member groups in different countries around the globe, and we are environmental social justice organization. We always consider also those two aspects and the economic justice aspects in our analysis and approach. So in a way, we are beyond fragments, even in starting or doing an analysis of what to do in terms of campaigning or goals and strategies. I would say that we are in a way maybe pioneering on global level and European level in that regard among environmental organizations, starting to work with movements like La Via Campesina, with trade unions and debate on different issues, primarily just transition. So in next years, basically, we will focus on many issues, but I would like to single out maybe two issues that are going to be very significant. One is our Fossil-Free Europe campaign, which basically aims to shift Europe to 100% renewables through just transition by 2030. That's very utopistic and ambitious goal, as you can imagine. There are many elements of this campaign, and we'll have to work with grassroots and other movements, including trade unions, to achieve it. And second, maybe very interesting campaign that is part of wider debate on future of Europe. As you might be aware, that there was the 5th scenarios proposed, like what future of European Union should look like. Civil society response was to develop 6th scenario in 2017. Friends of the Earth Europe was leading organization in coordinating that, I would say, cross-sector civil society manifesto and work. And we are now continuing beyond that scenario into debating positive number for future of Europe. We do lots of resistance work, like resisting new investment in coal, oil, and gas. But we realize that we have to move beyond resistance. We should not stop doing it, but we need to have positive vision, positive goals, how this future should look like, so that people aspire to something. In our own analysis on change that we need to do, and as an answer to let's say, increasing threat from right-wing politics in Europe, we believe that we need to share this narrative and develop it together with people. So in next months, actually, we are going to develop a narrative of vision of future of Europe with communities around Europe and other organizations from civil society, from different sectors. So there is this, I would say now, already a custom of working across a sectorial divide, which is not easy, as you can imagine. Sometimes things are very slow, but I would say the final results is always much better than when you have your own story, which you don't test with people on the ground, with other stakeholders, and then you think you have the only truth. So I would say it's a harder way, but it's a better way, and the results are better as a consequence. So this future, the solutions, of course, they have different elements in fields of sustainable agriculture, sufficiency, which is basically linked, the concept that is linked with the degrowth. We would like to explore even more connection with the degrowth movement, for instance, in future. It's connected with community energy as one of the answers to how the future of energy should look like, the centralized community. And of course, the main aspect of that is where we're going and how we get there. So we are talking then about transition. So when we talk about just transition, obviously we're not talking all the time about the same thing. Even with our broad federation around the globe, we don't have one definition of it. In Europe, we use a definition that was actually adopted or developed by trade unions, that is based transition for fair transition, just transition for the workers in fossil fuel industry, that they require decent jobs in that shift towards renewables. There are much broader definitions of that term. You can use socially fair definition to transition to explain that. Some people are considering looking at the whole regions, like coal regions, how to make development of those regions post-coal. In some other countries, particularly in countries in the global south, where the trade unions are not so strong and not so present, and many workers are not unionized, or there is not even workers, because we are talking about local communities that are impacted by the development of fossil fuel, like examples from Nigeria, where you have local communities that live in Niger Delta, and they basically don't benefit from that oil that's there, and there is so much pollution from it that they suffer. So they already talk about just transition to renewables that are going to be owned by those communities, and they are going to provide the energy needs for those communities. Of course, we can always talk about transition that we need to do in terms of economy to get back into planetary boundaries and at the same time meet the needs of the people on the planet. Some people call that great transition. I think really that's a debate that we probably need to discuss how we do it and which elements need to be in place that we have that great transition. If we take into account that we need to bring the global socio-economic system under planetary boundaries and provide for the needs of the people, then we'll probably come to conclusion that current socio-economic system is not the answer to that goal. And then again, we are crossing the fragmentation of different campaigning into something bigger, where we need to have a vision of how this socio-economic society should look like if we want to meet these two prerequisites, to these two goals. To conclude, I really tried to fit in my 1 minute. This was really, really brief. I would say that we are really interesting time where these discussions are everywhere among different movements, and we in Friends of the Earth really started this discussion like 10 years ago, or maybe even longer. So we can share our experiences, and we can also learn from others. I was very impressed to go out of our kind of niche, going to the DeGroat conference or some other conferences, meeting with trade unions, and exchanging debating on how we achieve this transition together. Thanks.
Thank you, Jagoda. Vincent, you're coming from DeGroat mostly concept, and regarding this need to go beyond fragments, to have for the society just transition, to go out of our so-called comfort zone. I guess that so many times you heard that DeGroat is basically, you know, too radical, too much for ordinary people. So basically, how you look at these needs for reach as much people as we need to go, you know, out on the ground, especially in today where people are feeling quite, you know, fear, isolated, insecure, with the DeGroat model that is, let's say, mildly quite demanding.
Yeah. So, 7 minutes. I suggest 3 points. First point, I think we are having quite a large political victory from a cultural point of view. Maybe you will be surprised with that. Second point, this cultural victory is totally hacked by demagogic, opportunist politicians. Third point, we need to be radical, more radical than ever to defeat that. So first point, cultural victory. 10 years ago, when we spoke about climate change, we needed to take a lot of time to explain what is it. It was very abstract and so on. Nowadays, I'm afraid it's not useful anymore. People are realizing, this summer was one more alert, that there is something wrong in the system. Also, from a lot of point of view, we are living in a society with a lot of fear. Economic fear, created fear. Fear of the strangers, the refugees, terrorism, whatsoever. Fear of losing our position, fear of losing our chance to survive, what our children will do in such a world. Other point, people are tired, exhausted, overwhelmed. A society when we don't have time to slow down, to think, to cool down, to be like what we do for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, be on the beach, talk to each other, reflect on how beautiful, difficult, great, our challenges and so on. People are overwhelmed. Work, more stress in work, unmeaningful job. Stress, when you don't work, you compensate with more and more consumption and everything. And they realize there is something wrong. We consume, but are we happier? Also, life expectancy is reaching limits. We've always been promised that, this modern society, more technology, we will be more and more in good condition, in good health, and life expectancy will grow. We start to see some studies that maybe it's more difficult than that. We promise green technologies, green transition. Doesn't work. We were in Malmö last week for the 6th International DeGroat Conference. I was so surprised to see that it's very critical. Swedish society is not the dream, what we can see from the rest of the world. Green technological transition, good feminism, welfare society. In the same time, the strongest, quickest rising inequalities in this country. Far-right movement, populism also growing up. What's going wrong with this system? Also, we see a lot of converging surveys all around the world with people making step aside, changing their habits, consume less to have a better life, reappropriate free time, rethink how we can work differently. When it is possible, unfortunately, only a minority of people can do that. The same for this minority of people who are privileged, a lot of creativity, a lot of dynamics, making step aside and create the world of tomorrow. New ways to produce, to exchange, to take decision. Fortunately, it's far away from being enough. Second point, all this transformation, fear, problems, tension in society, totally hacked by two main populism. Macron, Orban. Macron, startup nation, the new king, will change the world, I'm a technocrat. French corporation will save the world, electric car, clean nuclear power plants, and he goes to China, he speaks to the Chinese. Trump is an idiot, we will change the world, no problem. Don't worry, technocrats knows what to do. Meantime, we sent 4,000 soldiers to fight against few hundred of utopians like us trying to construct the walls of tomorrow in Notre-Dame-des-Landes. Why? Macron understood that the danger is coming from here. It's coming from the creativity, from the radicality. You have to kill immediately, not the airport, because he canceled the airport. He doesn't care about one more or less airport. It's not a problem. We have to kill what we were winning to impose a debate on the airport and its world. What kind of paradigm is behind the idea to construct an airport? Is it really what we want? Other side, Orban. Orban is the king of democracy, complaining about these idiotic technocrats like Macron. Because of them, Europe is under threat. They provocated Brexit. They don't understand the poor people who are afraid, who are living in fear of corporation, of capitalism, and so on. Macron, Orban, the same. This summer, even if they pretend to fight against each other, in France, Macron passed a new law about immigration, word by word exactly what's happening in Hungary. But one needs the other one to keep on going, to depoliticize the debate, to avoid to go into, third point, radicality. What we need is radicality. Why are they winning? Because we were unable to bring on the table the real debate, to repoliticize the question of climate change, of rising inequalities, of this world. We've been taken in this trap that neoliberalism is apolitical, no politics. We are administrating a system. It's like the law of nature. We cannot save climate change because our economy is like that. We have to destroy health, education because of public debts. So be radical. People are reading, sometimes fake news, but people know how to say to information. I would even say that based on my experience in the last years, giving talks about degrowth in a lot of different types of environment, I realize that less educated people are understanding much better degrowth than technocrats, who are living in denial. But they are afraid of degrowth because it means for them that their position, privileged position, dominant position in society, is under threat. We have to think about another world based on other values. We have to think about type of proposals to really protect the people, to put back in this world of fear some security, serenity, unconditional basic income, share the work hours. We have to limit the rising inequalities, maximum income. We have to get rid of this crazy financialization of economy, fiscal evasion, public debt. We don't pay back. We don't pay back the public debt. The future of our children are more important than an economic model, what we don't care, which is based on fake news. And so on and so on. So more than ever, we should be ourselves, to be coherent and to create trust. If not, the people will go to Orban, or the other one will say, Orban are just followed by idiotic, we are the technocrats, we have the right to impose to the people the green technologies and green transition and everything. I will conclude with one interesting story happening in France. In France, the number 3 of the government is a degrowth person, Nicolas Hulot. He's isolated in this government, he cannot do anything. He's humiliating every day by Macron and the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. And Edouard Philippe, Prime Minister, is an intellectual. He likes to read books, he's able to understand. Nicolas Hulot advised him to read Jared Diamond Collapse. Edouard Philippe read the book and said, thank you, Nicolas. Great book. It changed my vision of the world. Very interesting, very inspiring. But I have another conclusion than you. Our societies may be collapsing, but while reading Jared Diamond, I saw that some societies managed to avoid collapse with technocratic, technological solution. We are the solution. And I think our main enemies are not Orban, but this type of people who believe in technologies, who believe in this society where we should dominate the nature and who deny what makes life wonderful, death. And we have to put back in the political discussion, death. We have to put back in our political discussion the fact that we are human beings and life is wonderful because we are human beings. There are unpredictability. There are a lot of wonderful things happening which are outside of this dominant world. So, be radical. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ágnes, you have been researching commons tradition and solidarity economy transition in this region, Central and Eastern Europe, for many years. So do you see here in this region some actors, good practices, good cases of solidarity-based politics, economics, activism, something that can also be something that is already in this position of being some kind of good example of just transition of or going beyond fragments?
Well, I see good examples. Most of them are here. So that wouldn't be that much new. I thought I would just share, some conclusion points or insights or whatever ideas that I might have from my perspective, which is, on the one hand, working from a world systems perspective on what is politics in this region in the long term, which means, these long-term dynamics of world systemic integration of the region, how they appear on the political level, and from my activist work. But the conclusions are not about this level. They are about the question of the panel more generally, that is how to move beyond fragments and so on. And they are related to myself listening to the discussions for the last days. So one of the things that would follow for me from this background, is that if we think of capitalism as a global thing, global historical process, that accumulates value on the top and extracts it from the social and ecological reproduction globally, then speaking about how to do things in Europe or how to do things in cities in Europe, in big cities of Europe, then you are speaking from the top positions of these hundreds of years of accumulation extraction process. So it's really hard to think politically from this perspective when you want to think in terms of, relocalizing, getting back what is taken from us in the present neoliberal phase. But at the meantime, you need to somehow produce new systems that are mostly about giving back what we took for all those hundreds of years. The second point would be the political level of this. It seems to me, not only here, but generally going to these kind of discussions in Europe, is that the political imagination is very much shaped, of course, by the local European history of it, out of which comes this diagnosis that we seem to take for granted so many cases, that, what's the history of politics? It is that we used to have democratic capitalism, but unfortunately with neoliberalization we lost it. Now it's financialization, deindustrialization, austerity, and that means post-politics because you don't have the unions and cannot vote for proper social democrats who would do their jobs. But this story is just the European and North American story of the global story, that aspect. If you think of it in the global terms, there was never such terms of democracy in capitalism. Democracy in capitalism meant that you have something like democracy in the top that is using all the value and redistribution that is extracted from the whole global system. So if you take this story seriously, then the way you think forward from a European perspective becomes a question of, how do you connect the problems of Europeans losing this to the problems of those people who have always been on the other side of it. Then on the agency level, the way the same problem appears is that most of the discussion is about either how to do something locally or community level, or how to do it within the political structures that exist. The political structures that exist are not on the systemic level of capitalism, they are on the nation-state level, and that's, as the classic saying goes, is one of the conditions why it is so stable and why it is so hard to do anything about it in a political way. So in this sense, when we are talking about what to do, and only think about it in terms of governance, either local or state, from my background, one of the main conclusions is that, yes, but you also need to consider the material process, how we are interlinked globally, and what to do with that. Most probably, the governance that you can do on the local or the state level is going to be very limited about it. But maybe we have also other tools. Maybe we can build new infrastructures of globally integrated cooperations that can go into the material relations and change that. And then the last aspect was the crash. When you think about how we can join fragments in our political strategy and so on, you know, there is this crash that is hovering above us. How do you think about moving beyond fragments in this horizon? Not only saying that we need to do everything to allow the crash, or only say that the crash is coming and we cannot do anything, but to think that the crash is coming, which is realistic, and then build global integrated infrastructures which might you know, help us in those situations.
Thank you. Andreas, for many years in activist circle there was this notion of one no and many yeses. You know, we were basically one no and many yeses. You know, we were basically proud of this, so many fragments, and basically like some prize of pluralism of movements. And basically now maybe we are considered that more as our weakness, because those fragments stay very often isolated and not so, you know, connected in one, I don't know how to say, one wave. And how you see this basically, on the one hand, need to appreciate everyone's identity or base from where we are coming, or maybe need for a new hegemony or new narrative that can unite all of us to be more visible in society and get more strength.
Yeah, challenging question. I will try to answer, as it's already late, with the concrete example that I am, where I am participating and why I am involved, and that's Vienna and our attempts to move beyond fragments via our Good Life for All activities, which have, and the term also has emerged some 10 years ago, inspired by the Latin American experiences in different organizations like Attack Austria, the Austrian Green Foundation, a Catholic organization. And these groups together formed an alliance, a red-green alliance over the last years, with the explicit attempt, and I think that's important when one talks about a hegemonic project, that it has a process dimension and it has a content dimension. And the process dimension, as you said, is you need broad alliances. I tell my students that we have to leave the bubble of this nice, well-intended middle class students of socio-ecological economics and policy, where all are convinced that it's necessary to change radically and relate and dialogue and learn from and convince ordinary people. And that's what we tried in this in two congresses in 2015 and 2017 with over 1,000 participants. And it was the first congress a few months after the huge success of the Leipzig DeGroat conference. And our attempt and the difference that we made was we integrated trade unions, a difficulty in the DeGroat movement. We had an intensive dialogue with Vincent and others from the Degrowth movement, but we aimed at being broader, integrating social democratic organizations, the Böll Foundation, the trade unions, and even the Luxembourg Foundation, which is interesting, and it's really trying to extend towards Germany as well. So broad alliance with respect to the process, but, and that's the second aspect, you need a common imaginary and a common understanding, and that's what the Good Life for All, in my understanding, offers very well, because it combines the good life, the aspiration of living differently, living not at the expense of other people, other regions, other continents. So it's the green, sustainable dimension in these two words, and the for all is the radical dimension and the uncommon linkage of the good life. There are a lot of attempts for achieving good life, much less with this idea to universalize it. So that's the red dimension, the equality dimension of this imaginary. And I think it's, and we made the experience that it is a unifying concept. It allows a lot of initiatives to participate. It allows people with a very concrete project idea to identify, but it also inspires intellectual discussions of a world where a good life is possible for all, a civilization totally different from all civilizations that we had so far. This content dimension, in the cooperation with these different movements, had, and I think this is a real achievement, having trade unions as key partners in such a cooperation, is the understanding that we have to go beyond consumerism and money-centered economy. And the key concept in the first conference was building social ecological infrastructure. And I think the idea to achieve mobility for all, energy for all, is based on a different infrastructure. And the huge advantage of infrastructures is they are not commodities. They can be public goods. They need not be produced all the time. They exist, and therefore they have a huge potential for degrowth in the material sense. And the second conference, just to see how the discussions result in learnings, was, yes, infrastructure is important, decisive even for a non-consumerist way of life, good public transport, possibility to go by bicycle. But this is very difficult to achieve in cities and regions under austerity, under European governance. So we have to change the global, the European rules of the game, and that's what I tried to present in the morning as deglobalization. So to kind of summarize, I think the aspiration of a new hegemony, of moving beyond fragments, really has to be tried to be broad, to try to speak and interact with ordinary people that have a very clear idea of the good life, housing, education, health. You can easily explain that's not necessarily consumerist. And it has this content dimension which I just described, and it needs discussion, dialogue of a broad variety of actors. Thank you.
Dirk, you are quite experienced and in basically working on city level on municipality level. You are a member of City Council of Ghent in Belgium. So municipalism is basically, let's say, rather new phenomenon in Europe. And basically there are more and more voices that for progressive movement this should be a new battleground of activism, of working more and not so on national level, maybe even on international level. Do you have any comment on that, especially regarding this subject of fragmenting, moving beyond fragment? Is it false dichotomy, or on one hand, you know, there is comments that people from rural area bring Brexit, they are voting for Trump, etc. Is it a false division, or on the other hand, we can't neglect that basically progressive forces had some victories on city levels in Europe? So maybe some of your comments on that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed, I think that what's happening in cities nowadays is very important, because you can look at Europe at two ways. The first way we read every day in the newspaper, it's about national governments fucking us up, not being able to work together, whether it's on climate policy or it's on refugee policy. So it's like a broken Europe. But if you then look at the city level and you read about it and you visit cities, you explore more and more innovative citizen actions. You see governments trying to develop new ways of governing, new ways of governance, and then, and I will come to that later, you can develop this vision that if we would construct Europe from networks of progressive cities, of networks of fearless cities, we could build a new kind of movement connecting tens of millions of Europeans. So I think, yes, it's very important that what we observe there. I think that from a starting point, I always find it very important to say that, and this summer has shown it again, it's not because people know things are going wrong, they are changing their behavior. So we have to develop a narrative, what I call on the level of values, kind of normative horizon. It's not a technocratic story. It's not about getting rid of cars in our city, which we are doing in Ghent, but we are telling it's about the quality of life. It's about the ability that children can play in the streets. It's about reclaiming public domain. And the two values that then I always mention is first freedom. We all, as progressives, talk about freedom, emancipation, but I always express it in combination with security. There's a lot of fear in society. We have the conservatives redefining security as a military security, but we should look back at history, what emancipation meant in the 20th century. It was social security. So we now have to build a model of social ecological security. So we have to claim this word. We will work on the security for the people. And so, yes, if we look what are the sources of hope in Europe, I think there are two. First, it are the commons. We spoke a lot about this. And what I want to add is that it's not a coincidence that now again, people are organizing themselves. If you look at the history of the commons in Europe, you can speak now of the third wave of commons. And every time there's a wave, when you have the combination of a market and a government failure. The first wave was in the Middle Ages, very fast urbanization, market society, and people organized themselves, for instance, in guilds to stabilize their income and help each other. 19th century industrialization, you have this second wave, cooperatives, unions, mutual help organizations. And so now, again, we have the combination of a market and a state failure, and we see these commons, and it's really a strong movement. There are much more commons than we think. In Belgium, we've done research, and we found that in 2014, there were more than 10 times more commons established than 10 years before. So it's really happening. And then at the same time, we see more interesting things at what I call progressive cities. I don't have to mention Barcelona, but also other cities. Like, for instance, if you look at mobility, it's very interesting. You see more and more cities trying to get rid of cars, while at the same time, you see governments investing in more and more highways. And so more and more you see this split, these two levels. You see, look at the migrant crisis. You have the Spanish government, you have the Italian government saying, we don't want to accept boats with migrants. And then you have mayors of progressive cities, Valencia, Naples, say, we will welcome them. So I must confess, my hope in governments is going down every day. But then I see these progressive cities, and then I get very hopeful. So the challenge is, and I think it's a double challenge, is these new city governments with cities full of commons, they have to create a new model of governance. The city government has to change into what I would call a partner state, and the commoners, they have to develop what I would call a new urban urban unions. Because now a lot of commerce are very working separated. Energy, money, food, mobility, but we need for every city, and let's say in the 20th century we had the unions of the factories. I think now in the 21st century we need the unions of the cities, working together, forming one force. The second challenge is, of course, we have to change the economy. Only changing the political level and still buy your food at Monsanto and going sleeping in the evening with Airbnb and stuff like that, it won't change a thing. So we have to set up more experiments for a commons-based urban economy and kind of develop prototypes, developing urban, regional, circular economy. And this means really building new infrastructures and mutualize them, working together. So to give one example, Airbnb, which is making living unaffordable in more and more cities, it was very interesting. It were not the national governments, but it were cities reacting, Berlin, Amsterdam, and so on. And so in Amsterdam, people are now developing Fairbnb as an alternative. We should make sure that 10 cities work together around this, and within 5 years, in every city in Europe, we can stay in a Fairbnb room, so the money doesn't go to Silicon Valley, but stays in our community. As a final point, how can we motivate people to participate in this? And Vincent already said a lot of people have fear of change and they are reluctant. So we have to develop what I call a new security package for the 21st century. People more and more in Europe work too hard, have to work 2 jobs, burn out. So we have to introduce a shorter working week together with a universal basic income. So people have more autonomous time. And say again, and I think this is one of the big failures of social democrats, we need good social services, good education, good health system, affordable, accessible to everybody. And with this, I think we can convince more people at more cities, and then we should think about what I would call leagues of progressive cities. And of course, a city is never isolated. A city is in a region. And so it also has to connect with this region, with the, for instance, it's obvious for the food system, but it's also obvious for other systems. So by this, we can develop this kind of urban centers, sustainable regions working together. And of course, by that, the nation state will not wither away. But at the moment, 70% of the people in the European Union live in cities. So if we can conquer the cities, we can win Europe again. Thank you.
Thank you. I have some other points to rise up, but maybe this is also good time regarding the time if you have some. We heard really 5 inspiring stories and inputs. If you have something to ask, debate, comment, please raise your hand.
Hey, thank you all for a good and inspiring night, and thank you for waiting for late start and everything. There's no surprise in which ways I would like to go with this, but then I wouldn't. I'm interested in the last point of Dirk's with the connection of cities. There was a story once that Yugoslavia industrialized and wanted to modernize intensely to become this proper state with industrial production and urban living on the backs of the expropriation of peasant food production by simply paying them too low for the work they do because they were backward. They were certainly not going to turn too communist. They had their religious practices, and eventually their kids were going to move off to the cities and become nice, good citizens. Isn't that a danger for our cities that you're envisioning, that unless Vincent's urban agroforestry is going to work, we're going to have to talk to the rurals as well if we're going to eat in these regions?
Of course, in every country, the agricultural sector is different, so I'm not expert in this country. But I can tell you, in my country, most farmers are going bankrupt because they're hijacked in a capitalistic financialized system, and more and more farmers are very interested in not providing food for the world market that never pays enough, but to relate again to local consumers that are willing to pay a fair price. So I think there's also a good opportunity, but every country probably will be different, so I'm a bit careful here.
I also think one of the tragedy what we are experiencing nowadays, it's what we call the metropolization of the world. In particular, a forced metropolization of the world, which is ending up in this type of electoral mappings with very, very huge, not only economic, but also cultural inequalities. And you have these processes not only in every country, but also regional processes. I think about, for example, the tragedy of Hungary, where I live nowadays, where in the last year, 500,000–600,000 young people left the country to make bullshit jobs in Vienna, in London, in Berlin, and so on. And because they don't have any other opportunity. And also, I think about the region where I grew up, where maybe I should be tonight and not with you, enjoying a fancy, great, nice, intellectual life, what I also enjoy in the city center of Budapest. I should be living in the region where I grew up, in eastern France, which is an old industrial region with a very high level of unemployment, with a lot of violence, and also with all the people like me who had the chance to be privileged, wealthy, to have a degree, who went to Paris or went abroad because that's the place you get a job and also life is better. And because, we don't have any opportunity to go back, and maybe I would be happy to go back, and maybe a lot of people would be happy to go back. And it will solve both the question of food systems, the question of much better balance on how we occupy our territories and everything, but also the cultural question and the rising inequalities from a cultural point of view, to bring back much more dialogue. I mean, when you're back to the region you grew up, you have to be in dialogue with the people who are voting for Jobbik, Front National, or Marine Le Pen, or Orban. And I see there, I mean, I would agree that the city are a fantastic pillar on which we can work because there is a lot of cultural, economic capital, but I think we should also rethink and be creative how to rebalance how the people are occupying the territory and how to rebalance the human interaction between the people. And yes, I believe in urban agroforestry.
Me too.
I just to add, I think that the idea of smaller economic units implies to think the city and the countryside related. I've heard that in the second largest Austrian city, they plan to have the target of 30% local food production in 2030. So that's an interesting strategy, which would imply having some type of a different relation of city and countryside.
I'm Giacomo from University of Coimbra, Portugal, and senior fellow at IPE, Zagreb. My question is for Ágnes, because I think she's trying to make a very different argument of all the others, and in terms of global infrastructure, if I understand properly. So I would like to listen a little bit more. What do you mean with that, and how you are thinking of creating this global infrastructure? Because the argument that you are doing should be really more thought through, because it's true that probably this extractive capacity that we have here in Europe probably help us to think about this horizontal process for saving ourselves as European, but perhaps this global infrastructure would be interesting to understand what you mean. Thanks.
Just to understand, are you saying that if I say global infrastructure, it would mean that the core of the global economy, you would impose it on the others? Is that what you mean?
I'm just asking if you can expand on that. What do you mean? Because I don't know about.
Please. Yeah, what was the word that I was using? That new infrastructures of globally integrated systems of cooperation, in which the cooperation is the main thing, which would mean whatever solidarity economy, degrowth, commons logic is, and we can call it in according to various traditions in different names, either saying that, you know, it's not about accumulating value, it's about generating reproductive capacity, it's about protecting this reproductive capacity from external capital extraction, and it's also about what they call reverse cooptation, you know, sucking in resources that are now still in the capitalist market, and then growing this system. So if you think of it in this global hierarchy terms, on which, you know, European cities are sitting on the top of it, then it wouldn't only be doing it in one European metropolis, but I say that in the politics of this, we need to think about how to establish these kind of corporations globally in such a way that, you know, it allows this kind of value flow in the opposite direction, and it allows for a cooperation that strengthens this kind of reproductive capacity in all the places. And then, okay, let's get back to the real thing. What do I think about? There are so many ways of thinking about this, you know, the established ways of global aid and all the rest, which are awful. I'm thinking about it from the solidarity economy perspective, and the commons perspective, and from the anarchist aspect of it, which means that you try to establish logics, practices, and infrastructures of cooperation that are about establishing also a situation where nobody can take power. It's not about taking power in this way or the other, but doing it like that. So if you think about that in material terms, it is about cooperatives, about not certain type of cooperatives, but the ones that are that conform to this generative, horizontal, commons, etc. logic. And then wherever you try to do cooperatives or cooperative systems, they are going to meet the problem that they are too small, they are drowned in the sea of the capitalist market environment. And what I meant by these integrated systems or infrastructures of cooperation was how we can scale these kind of cooperative efforts, not in a way that they don't remain local or that we are going to produce this big volume of material trade, but in terms of just thinking politically and strategically about what we need, in which way we need to be connected. One very obvious way is that in terms of finance, we need to be connected. We need global infrastructures of anti-finance that are grained in this kind of solidarity collaboration. And then there are all the other very easy solutions of open source commons of everything. I mean, I think in the commons thinking, when you take it to the max and you think about it as a systemic alternative, then it has to be local. And then you start to think about these kinds of infrastructures. For me, why it is interesting is that it's very immediate. We can start building such things immediately. And then I'm not talking as if this wouldn't be happening. It's not my idea. I think up to now, the biggest infrastructure that is built in exactly this line is Faircoop and the Bank of the Commons. But it's also not only their idea. I think it's in this kind of thinking, it's all over the place.
Well, just maybe complicate with Dirk. We're moving beyond fragments, and it's maybe a question. Maybe we are too pleased that some successes that we are having on the municipal level, local level, and should we maybe take into account not only the rural aspects that are important in connection to maintaining urban structures, but also the systemic, let's say, setup of capitalism where the nation state controls currencies, where it's not, it also still has some sovereignty that is democratically can be operationalized. So can we really imagine that a city, isolated or even in connection, would be enough to present viable, strong enough alternative for some kind of transition? Will the state just wither away? Do we need it? Do we need something else?
I think we live in a kind of multi-level reality. You have cities, you have nation states, you have Europe, you have global institutions, and they all take part of the power game. So I think two things important. Yes, I believe that leagues of cities can, for instance, go directly to the European level to press for certain policies that now nation states are blocking. So I think that's one possibility, which is very interesting. Two, I see these cities as also a kind of first step, a possibility, there's no guarantee, possibility of building new connections, narratives, and power structures in every country, in the hope that it can allow for new strategies for national elections. We have to, if you have to build first kind of local infrastructure, connecting different areas with a new narrative, new movement, and I think this can be a way to then again try to gain power at the level of the nation state, because it's there. It's in most countries still the fundament of the social security system, so it would be very unwise to say, in a short time, let's get rid of it. So for me, it's kind of, cities can be the first step in kind of trying to build a new hegemony, and again, get the majority at the nation-state level, with then, of course, the task of really changing how it functions. But we don't have to be naive. We saw the example of Greece. So we probably need multiple strategies at the same time. In certain countries, maybe it can be done to build electoral strategy power. At the same time, leagues of cities pushing for other policies at the European level, and then maybe see what kind of coalitions are possible, alliances. but it will be different than before. So we're ahead for, I think, a time of experimentation.
There is also a need to, regarding this moving beyond fragment and just transition, to go beyond Europe. So on global level, because of a need, some kind of also responsibility. So maybe Jagoda, you were, through your work and activism, you work a lot with people from other continents, from so-called South or Third World. We mentioned a little bit people from Nigeria. Dirk mentioned how some progressive cities accept immigrants. So where are these place for cooperation beyond Europe in this subject that we are mentioned here on the panel?
Yeah, well, I think there is lots of room for that. I mean, in my previous position, I was working much more international level. Now I moved to Brussels to work on European level, and I feel a bit strange there because they're so focused on European Union policies, even in civil society very often. And it's somehow they don't see the outer world out of Europe, and there is all world out there. And Europe has big impact on that for 500 years. Basically, we are using resources from others to have the life that we have now in Europe. So solidarity is very important to us in Friends of the Earth, and we want to bring, and we are bringing these stories. For instance, even in Croatia, we gave example of Plomin case. There was a direct story of Colombian community, Afro community, indigenous communities that are impacted by coal mine that we are importing here. So the more stories we bring here, and more solidarity we show them by actually putting pressure on international corporation that had headquarters here, they're violating human rights. For instance, we're also campaigning with other civil society organizations on binding treaty under UN framework for corporations that violate human rights globally, so that they cannot have double standards. They cannot have one standards in Europe and then actually endangering even people's lives in other places. So the more such connections there are, or campaigns are going to be more successful. And just maybe building on what Dirk said about like we have to bring, I mean, I also mentioned that in terms of like we are developing solutions. Yes, we have to develop solutions. We have to develop positive narratives. We have to reclaim maybe some of the words. But the values, we have to really reach out to people through the values, you know, like when you look at now climate and migration that's already happening, and it's probably going to increase in the future. And it's already a big story, like in the European Union now they're talking about how to protect the borders. The next multinational framework, the new budget that was planned for the European Union is going to increase money for Frontex to protect the borders. So it's actually building on that narrative that we are kind of closing the borders of Europe, and then we are doing one society for us here, for those who are privileged enough to have citizenship, and then everybody else somewhere there. I don't believe in such Europe. I think even with lots of money and military power, such Europe will never succeed. We have to really work with people in other continents if we want to have sustainable society and if we want to have just society.
I mean, we live in a very, very uneven world, full of inequalities, and we are part of the rich part of this world. And I think that you can take two conclusions out of this. The one thing is we should help those that are in a worse position, and there is a rather dubious history of the rich countries helping the poor. Also, I don't deny that might be also important, but one has to be very cautious. The whole development aid, etc., missionary attempts have been westernization is not only a success story. And the second strategy is reducing the damage that we are causing on the periphery. And when I talk about economic deglobalization, it's exactly the second strategy of reducing the damage. And I think there is a huge potential. Reducing oil dependency would have a very positive effect on the Middle East, reducing resource dependency on other resource-producing countries. So I think there are the two strategies. I don't say that helping and cooperation, etc., is not also a possible strategy, but definitively the other one is a strategy we should pursue more than we have done so far.
I'm very glad because this year we will have the first international DeGroat conference about Global North, Global South dialogue in Mexico City, where a lot of thematics will really be about what we can do together and what we can learn from each other and how we can cooperate. From critics to extractivism, critics to development, rights for indigenous people to our interdependencies. And it's really back to one of the main roots of DeGroat, which is, I think, critics to development, and maybe started in 2002 in UNESCO in a very, very fantastic conference, which name was Deconstruct Development, Reconstruct the World. And we are 16 years later, and I think this debate hasn't been open enough. And we have a lot to learn from Global South, where also, like here, it's not a monolithic things happening. There are also a lot of rising movement questioning development, questioning the Western way of life, which has been imposed. To quote Animata Traoré, the ex-minister of culture in Mali, was to rape the imaginary. And I'm really, really, really enthusiastic with this type of debate, because there is no chance for Global South to reappropriate self-determination in their own way if in the cities, everywhere in the north, we don't decrease radically our impact on the environment, on how much energy, how much input we need to sustain a way of life which is everything but desirable.
I wanted to ask from Andreas a question, actually, to something what you mentioned before, and maybe I misunderstood, but you said something that activists should stop being active, and at the same time you were talking about the Good Life for All conference, and to my understanding, this has been actually one of the most inspiring moving beyond fragments kind of alliance examples. For example, in Germany, the civil disobedience movement and the Gelände and Climate Camp have been working and collaborating that intensively on the same ground together with the DeGroat Summer School, that, you know, this activist side and putting your body really between, for example, extractivists, lignite mining and so on, in the global north. Not necessarily always it's important to address extractivism issues in global south as well, but kind of doing it in the spot where we can do it and where we should do it in the first place, that this activist side is obviously the most essential side and should go hand in hand with the academic Dirk movement and finding beautiful narratives and inspiring narratives for good life for all. So I'm just not sure if I misunderstood before or if you see it the same way.
No, yes, I was asking, that was a comment or was it a question? Because I'm totally in agreement what you said. Yeah. But perhaps I missed the point and you can tell me now or afterwards what.
Thank you very much. Talking about just transition and moving beyond fragments, I'd like to know, to all of you, I mean, if someone has a response, how to build a political strategy and paradigm to implement a just transition which goes in Europe, at least in Europe, from north to south, from east to west, and how is it possible, according to you, to build a more internationalist strategy, political message that could drive a just transition in all the continent? Because I feel also you've been talking about global north, global south, and so on. I also feel a lot of inequalities and and injustices, like according to the core of Europe and European semi-periphery, and at least in this continent we have a lot of messages to tackle. So which political strategy could build internationalist solidarity in all Europe? Thank you.
And you thought that my question.
Well, I'll try to answer, maybe. I'll try to respond. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer. So there is a big debate about just transition. For instance, we have started a debate in cooperation with trade unions on international level, mostly focusing on a direct debate with their representation of trade unions across the globe. And that was extremely good learning experience, I would say. In that transition for the workers, let's say, that kind of focus of it. But I don't believe that it's going to be only one kind of way for transition globally. There are many, many different examples in different contexts. As I already mentioned, like the different ways of doing it in Nigeria and in United Kingdom. For instance, in United Kingdom, and particularly Scotland, they're developing something that like Just Transition Commission on kind of state level that are going to define how they will make the shift to the from fossil fuel to renewables. In Netherlands, our member group Milieu Defensie is direct dialogue with trade unions, and they try to develop scenarios for Netherlands in terms of like concrete steps or pathway to shift to renewables. So we have such examples in different regions around the globe. We don't have one example that fits everybody. And on global level, obviously, we need to, in terms of demand, say like what we are saying, like global north should really defossilize as soon as possible, starting now, basically, or yesterday. That's supposed to be yesterday, but we were already late. Global South should really start to think of a different paradigm, because all the development models now are based on assumption that you have to utilize, you have to use fossil fuels to actually have certain standard of living or certain economy, which we know already it's not true. It's not only just like shifting to renewables, but we can explore all of different aspects as, you know, sufficiency, degrowth, and so on. So I think that's on global level, we still need to have this debate how also we support the Global South to do so because of historic responsibility and solidarity. So that's also recognized even in the Convention on Climate Change, that there should be a transfer of technology and knowledge to Global South. So there should be some kind of paying off for or ecological debt, or let's say, or use of resources, or overuse of resources over centuries. Of course, in reality, with current politics, that's a very unlikely scenario, as we know. The probability of its implementation is not so high, but our task is actually to, based on the values and based on let's say, moral values and responsibility, that we push for it and make the best out of it, to make the most out of it, actually.
So thank you for this very simple question. I will try to be as short as the question was. I would say a work in progress. Pluriversalism, diversity, biodiversity of different type of strategies, tactics, techniques, approaches, and so on, and links between them to keep on going with dialogue, tension, debates, and so on. And I would also insist on radicality. I mean, we don't have time anymore to don't be radical, and how to find the right balance between being radical without being extremists, being radical in being patient, which is sometimes quite difficult when you look at the last studies which are published about accelerating collapse, and to bring in our strategy a lot of enjoyment of life and conviviality.
It has been recently said that all this talk is good, but there's no time. There just isn't time. Professor Schellenhuber's worried that tipping points will be crossed beyond which there's no point in talking, there's no point in making action, there's no point in making strategies. And under that, there's been a suggestion that everyone, i.e. every political entity, currently every country, should decarbonize by 50% per decade, starting from now and going on to the relevant zeros. Could you comment each on how you see that strategy?
I'm not sure. The 50%, everybody knows.
Everyone, 50% every 10 years.
Well, yeah. Well,
everyone in the north.
Yeah, we have fair share approach, for instance, which we presented at climate model, and we calculated there how much different countries should count, that based on data that were reported to Convention Secretariat, and basically, of course, Global North should give more, or should cut faster, yesterday, basically, particularly United States, European Union, because they have capacity and they have responsibility. That's kind of a fair share approach that civil society adopted pre-Paris and post-Paris, demands how fast the decarbonization should go where. Of course, there's also these inequalities that are not only between the countries, but between individuals, because as we know, 10% of the richest, 10% of population, basically, global population, emits 50% of the pollution. So, like we should target that probably 10%, because if we force those who live already beyond decent level or basic level to meet their basic needs, I mean, even if they cut by 50%, which will make their lives much worse, they will not contribute that much. So we really have to focus on the biggest polluters.
I don't believe neither in linearity nor predictability. And I think we will face surprises in the upcoming future in every direction. And our goal is to try to minimize the upcoming barbarities, which quite likely will be terrible if we don't do anything.
With the incredible hot summer after us and hearing incredible reactions of a lot of people like, it's game over, so why should we do something? I think we know the strategies. I know this article. I agree with this project. What we need, I think, is to work on our incredible lack of moral imagination. We are not able, as a Western population, to imagine what a kind of cruelty we are preparing for our children. And so it's a kind of cultural, even artistic task to find ways that we enlarge the moral fantasy of people, that they are able to imagine and feel what they actually are doing. So I think this is very central. We can develop 20 technocratic trajectories which are necessary and other stuff, but for me, that's the lesson of this summer. How can we stimulate, revive moral imagination so that we, from an ethical point of view, are realizing what actually we are doing, also by doing nothing.
Ágnes? Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you a lot. I guess we answer all questions that you have on just transition and going beyond fragments, but please stay at Green Academy. At least tomorrow is a more easy day. Thanks to our panelists, and enjoy in your night.